I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. And this is the I Hate Politics candidate interviews with Anthony Brown and Katie Curran O'Malley, the Democratic candidates for Maryland Attorney General. I'm Sunil Dasgupta, host of I Hate Politics. If you are new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse, democratic, and sometimes divided societies. As part of the show, we have conversations with local, state, and sometimes federal candidates. Rather than ask them how they stand on a multitude of issues, these conversations try to get to the character of the candidate. For this week's candidate interviews, my guests are two very well-known political figures in the state of Maryland. Congressman Anthony Brown has been lieutenant governor to Martin O'Malley and ran for governor himself in the past. And he now finds himself running against his old boss's wife, Katie Curran O'Malley, who has been a circuit court judge in Baltimore for decades, and whose father, Joseph Curran, was once Maryland Attorney General himself, and came to that position after serving as Maryland Lieutenant Governor, just as Brown has. Both are Democratic candidates. There is a Republican field, and we will get to that in the general election race after the primary, which is now scheduled for July 19th. On a personal note, a big challenge of putting out a show every week, and we have now done this for 61 consecutive weeks, is that I can't take off just because I have a cold. You'll hear the cold in my voice as I do the interviews. Please bear with me. Music for this episode comes from Emily Hall, a DC singer-songwriter who grew up in Wheaton. You can find her on Instagram at Songs by Emily Hall.
Rise above all the hatred and anger that leads us astray. Oh, I still believe in love today. No war that is fought can never be won. So lay down your weapons and throw out your guns. And don't be confused between what's black or white. Compassion's most powerful when we unite. I believe in love, sweet love. May the power of people rise above all the hatred and anger that leads us astray.
Anthony Brown, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Hey, it's great to be on with you. I love politics, but I don't mind being on the I Hate Politics podcast with you today.
Well, thank you so much for getting the irony here. You're running for Attorney General for Maryland. What do you think are the top 3 or 4 issues that the new AG will have to address?
The voters are expecting the Attorney General to have a prominent role in public safety. We're seeing crime rising, particularly during this pandemic. We're seeing, record rates of homicides in our major cities, and Baltimore is not immune from that. So there's an expectation among voters, among residents, that everyone who's elected to office, and certainly the Attorney General, public safety has to be a priority. And certainly we can talk more about sort of my ideas on that, but I'll tick through some of the other priorities. Another priority is worker protection. Workers, often are just at a disadvantage vis-a-vis their employers, and employers will sometimes misclassify someone as an independent contractor so they don't have to do the payroll deductions. and contribute to their Social Security, or we know of wage theft, where employers hold back wages that employees earned, and we also know that especially with the increase in the number of projects we're going to see with the federal dollars and the Infrastructure Investment Act, an increase in labor trafficking. So protecting workers, I think, is going to be an essential role for the Attorney General. And then the third thing, and again, it's not exclusive, right? There are a lot of other things, but enforcing civil rights laws. I think most Marylanders assume that the Attorney General can take an action if there's racial or ethnic or gender or any other form of discrimination in whether it's on the job, whether it's in housing, but the Attorney General doesn't. The Attorney General has a role. It's the Maryland Civil Rights Commission that takes those cases. If someone doesn't bring their own personal action, I think the Attorney General needs to have that authority to enforce the civil rights laws to protect Maryland.
So when you say you need legislation that enables the Attorney General to act in the civil rights arena, Maryland has one of the worst records in terms of incarceration of, African Americans in particular. Do you think this kind of arrangement has contributed to that?
I don't know if the lack of civil rights enforcement by the Attorney General has contributed to the over arrest, indictment, prosecution, and incarceration of African Americans. But I know one thing, you're right. There is an over-incarceration. And I do think that there are some things that ought to be done to address that. One of the things that I advocated for in Congress for the military justice system, which is a criminal system that applies to men and women who serve, where we also see a disproportionate incarceration and arrests and prosecutions of Black and brown service members. I've called for accountability throughout the system. And what do I mean by that? Maintaining, collecting, and analyzing data about the racial, the gender, the orientation and age, sexual orientation, gender identification of every service member who is arrested, indicted, prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced. So we can see where these racial and ethnic and other disparities are occurring. Is it in the prosecutor or is it in the judge? In the case of the military system, is it the commanders? And I think a similar approach should be taken to our criminal justice system in Maryland. Let's see where the fault lies. Why are we, not necessarily why, but who is contributing to the over arrest and incarceration, I should say, of Black and brown Marylanders?
The problem of incarceration of African American, disproportionate incarceration of African Americans in Maryland goes back decades now. Even during the time you served in Maryland. And if you don't know what the nature of the problem is, then it seems 8 years later, what are we doing?
So what we all understand to be the case is that there is severe sort of systemic racism, racial bias that goes way back to the times of slavery and Reconstruction. The mass incarceration of particularly Black men was a way to enslave men after slavery was supposedly abolished in this country. And then you had a mindset and a mentality and biases that Black men were more dangerous. You saw the over arrest and detention.
Yeah, but you were in the administration in Maryland during that time. So, and as a person that recognizes that, was that not visible to you at that time?
Oh, absolutely. And there's some things that we've done to improve the system. And I think major improvements. When I was lieutenant governor, I think those are the years you're referring to. We repealed the death penalty in Maryland, and we did it because we were able to convincingly show the data that a disproportionate number of Black men were being put on death row and being put to death within our criminal justice system in Maryland. And we showed that, and we had data. And So we were able to repeal the death penalty. And that was for me, the primary argument to be made. It's discriminatory and it's irreversible. So we've got to repeal it. And Maryland was, I think, the 21st state that repealed the death penalty. And I'm proud of that. And that I would say, hey, that's an improvement, but we still have a ways to go. It's still a system that is failing too many. And that's why certainly what I would introduce, and as the chief legal officer, as attorney general, I put the full weight of the office behind it. We got to collect data.
Okay, maybe this is maybe this is the way to understand it, right? The origins you described well, and I think there is general agreement on the origins of the system, right? But the persistence of the system is the problem, right? It has persisted through Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, Democratic administrations that included you. So I want to understand what the persistence is about, we agree on the origin.
Look, there is a general discomfort in this country when it comes to talking about race, right? I mean, think about what the Republicans are doing today, accusing Democrats of being racially divisive by talking about critical race theory.
Right. So is that a Maryland problem is what I'm understanding? How big a problem is that in Maryland, in your view?
I think that there is a challenge in every state, and Maryland's not immune, to talk about race. I was on a forum last night, and one of the candidates, not a Democratic candidate, a Republican candidate, when asked about the over-incarceration of Black or African Americans, and the question was, well, what can we do about it? And his response was, well, I'm not sure why we're talking about the over-incarceration of African Americans. We should just be talking about the wrongful incarceration of anybody. And to me, that sounded a lot like when I say Black Lives Matter and you respond by saying all lives matter. Well, all you're doing is dodging the difficult issue.
The percentage of those people in Maryland is low, right? I mean, we should be able to get this done.
Maryland's a fairly progressive state. I don't know if it's as progressive as the party registration suggests. We do have moderate Democrats in Maryland. We do. But look, we have to acknowledge the fact that we can talk about improving, for example, we can improve access to health insurance. And we think that, that helps everybody. Well, it doesn't. It's helpful, but it doesn't help those communities where now they have insurance, but they don't have health providers. And where are health providers lacking? Typically in Black and brown communities. So you got to be intentional about it, collect the data, and then apply the resources. When I was lieutenant governor, that's another thing that I did, created a program that went after health disparities, racial and ethnic health disparities. So you just have to be very intentional, and you got to be willing to collect, analyze, and discuss the data.
So were you not intentional when you were lieutenant governor?
Very intentional. And we got some things done. We got a lot of good things done. And the challenges persist. So because the challenge persists doesn't mean we're not making progress. And
sure. I think I was trying to distinguish between the origin story, which I agree with, absolutely with you, and the persistent story, and whether those things are different, and whether the levers to overcome persistence are different from the levers of sort of overcoming the original sin, which I don't think we can, because the sin is already committed, right? So it's in history. And so is the persistence, beatable? And I think the impression I'm getting is that you think that the persistence is not beatable until we actually address the original sin itself.
Right. And so part of addressing the original sins is eliminating the legal framework that perpetuated that. And I think we've made progress there, right? And we've got, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, although we know the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Supreme Court, and we're now trying to recover, right? So we've made, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. In some areas, we've made 3 steps forward and maybe no steps back. I mean, we've outlawed sort of redlining in housing. Does that mean that there aren't discriminatory practices? Yes. But for starters, you've got to eliminate the legal framework, the laws, the regulations, the policies that foster or allow discrimination to occur. The other thing that we have to do as policymakers, as public officials, is where we do see that legacy discrimination. I do think that you have to dedicate public resources to addressing that, right? And that's why I use, for example, that health disparity initiative that I use, where we're putting more dollars into underserved communities to make sure that health providers serve those communities. And I think that's very appropriate. Probably the most difficult piece is changing people's attitudes. And Agreed. You can't legislate that.
You also implied, or it's actually not implied, you said that, the problem of institutional racism is across the country everywhere. But on the other hand, Maryland is exceptional, not in a good way, on this incarceration issue. Right? We are number one, number two. I mean, that's, as a progressive state, that's really something.
And that's something that, as the next attorney general, I mean, that's why it's got to be a top priority. And that's not to suggest that it hasn't been. Like, as I said, we've done a number of things to improve our criminal justice system over the years, certainly when I was lieutenant governor, but that's going to be a top priority for me. So, whether it's the data piece, I think it also includes things like we have to invest more in sort of parole and probation and pre-release services to reduce recidivism. If we're going to, I think one of the best ways to reduce crime and to improve outcomes and improve lives is to invest in our returning citizens with employment services and house services and health services, so they're not prone to reoffend and return to prison or to jail.
Do you think then that this increase in crime numbers is basically from those that have committed crime before? Or is this, there's a lot, for example, with carjackings in Montgomery County were 14-year-olds that were not recidivist. Is your understanding of the growing public safety problem really around recidivism?
I think recidivism is important. There are some states that have been able to drive recidivism down to, within the 20%. Maryland is, I think, north of 40%. Now, again, during the 8 years when I was lieutenant governor, we did move it from like 48, 49 down to the low 40s. We were moving in the right direction. And I think it's important because, look, this is a quantifiable population of people who have demonstrated criminal conduct. So let's start with them. That doesn't mean that's the only population of people that we need to work with to reduce and eliminate crime. But here you have a population of offenders. So why not? And let's start with them. Let's help improve their lives so they don't come back in. And that does include, let's help them get a job.
Well, I'm trying to get a sense of your priorities. What type of crimes you see as increasing and being a problem? Right? It's not all kinds of crimes that are increasing. It's not that crime is increasing everywhere, right? There are some types of crimes that are increasing. What are those in your view? There are some, locations that are worse than others. What are those locations? And sort of let's see if we can find some causal connections here.
Look, I always think, starting with the most violent offenses, I really think you do. Look, murder, we're hitting historic highs in our homicide rate. And the loss of life, I think that, that should be the top priority. And associated with that are gun-related crimes, right? And so you need to address it from the standpoint of how do we, take guns off the street. Maryland's done more than a lot of states. There really does need to be a national solution because we're on the 95 corridor. So you can do all you want to do in Maryland, but if Virginia, Pennsylvania aren't cooperating, then you get gun trafficking right up and down I-95. But that's not an excuse not to take guns off the street in Maryland, and I would like to see us do that around the country. But also one of the proposals that I like that's being considered in the General Assembly right now is a gun court. Where if you have a case, and what we're seeing sometimes is you'll have a gun-related crime. Someone robs someone and they have a gun. They carjack with a gun. Or maybe they break and enter and they're armed. And often what we're seeing in the data is they were arrested 6 months ago for gun possession. Well, since it was only gun possession, they were, the gun was confiscated and they were released and off they went. And they know that because justice is not swift. Okay. If we have a gun court, which means any gun related offense, we're going to swiftly prosecute it. I think you're going to deter. It's going to help deter gun related crime. Is it going to eliminate it? No, but it's just one of the puzzle pieces to taking guns off the street or deterring people from using guns or at least possessing them in the community. So these are some of the things that are being proposed. What I don't necessarily support is the governor's proposal to double the penalties for gun-related offenses. I don't think increasing the penalty means a whole lot if you're not prosecuting the cases in the first place. I don't think the severity of the penalty is what is a deterrent to offenders. What's a deterrent is understanding that when I get caught, I'm going to be swiftly run through the justice system, the criminal system. I think that's a greater deterrent. So that's where I lean more on initiatives and innovative ideas like gun courts.
Okay. Do you believe that the AG's office is currently understaffed?
Look, I mean, and I think the public sector is understaffed. I really
sure.
do. I mean,
but in particular, but you talked about having 400 attorneys in a way that it was like, okay, we got it.
Yeah.
Are you understaffed or you got it?
So let me just say this. First of all, the vast majority of criminal prosecutions, investigation prosecutions are done at state's attorneys around in state's attorneys' offices around the state. And when you look at Prince George's County, they are understaffed. There's no doubt about it. When you look at Baltimore City, they have a staffing challenge. As Attorney General, I would certainly be advocating for increased budgets and staff for our state's attorneys. But I would also, as the Attorney General, deploy the investigators and prosecutors in my office in a very strategic way, in partnership with state's attorneys to go after their highest priority cases, to assist them, not taking over for them because it's their responsibility, but providing that resource to them. Does that mean that when I become Attorney General, I may have to look at the organization of the office to see whether the way it's currently organized reflects the priorities, the enforcement priorities of the community. And I'll just say, for example, but by no means is this fact, but maybe you learn that, like, wow, we're putting a lot of resources into. Well, I dare not say what I don't want to even do a hypothetical, because for someone for who that's important, they'll say, no, you're not. But we may have to readjust and realign personnel in the office to make sure that we're going after our big priorities. But it's important to understand that the Attorney General does a small percentage of prosecutions in Maryland.
With all the kinds of changes that you're suggesting, it seems that in your view that Brian Frosh, as the current Attorney General, did not do those things that you're proposing. Do I get that right, or do you have a different interpretation of that?
No, this is not commentary on Brian Frosh. And Brian Frosh gets high marks for a lot of the work that he's been doing in the office. And I think the Consumer Protection Division, which, I mean, that's a big division. That's everything from elder abuse to price gouging, to automobile sales, landlord-tenant issues. He has established a really extraordinary reputation, and that's important. And believe me, in the conversations that I've been having with voters, they want to know that their Attorney General's office is meeting those needs. So he's done good. He's also done a really good job working with the General Assembly in getting greater authorities to file actions or join suits against the federal government when the federal government's taking actions that harm Marylanders, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Labor, Department of Education. So, no, he's been doing a great job. And right now he's standing up in the area of public safety, the authority given to him by the General Assembly to be able to investigate police-involved deaths. So Brian's been doing a great job. I'm just telling you what my priorities are, and that should not be interpreted as a commentary on what is or is not happening in the Office of the Attorney General today.
Thank you for that clarification. What I find fascinating about what you just said is that a Maryland Attorney General can pursue consumer protection cases on their own, but not civil rights cases.
Yeah, no, and you caught it. I just think we've got to expand the authority. In some states, the Attorney General has what we call parens parenti authority. It goes back to common law. And the Attorney General was always viewed as someone who could step in the shoes of a citizen and enforce their rights and protect their privileges. In Maryland, now I'm giving you a little bit of a history lesson. In the 1800s, the legislature abolished the office of the Attorney General. And when they reestablished it in the Constitution, I think 4 or 5 years later, the Maryland court said, hey, the Attorney General is no longer sort of a creature of common law. You are now a creature established by the legislature through the Constitution. So the only powers you have are that which the legislature gives you. And that's limiting. We talk right now, right? We get a lot of consumer complaints about price gouging. The authority for the Attorney General to enforce anti-price gouging statute, it's about to expire in Maryland. He's got to go back to the General Assembly and extend it. It's like, why? I mean, why should I have to do that? Just give me the authority to do it, so I can always do it. And if you want to modify it or whatever, if you think that you have concerns, I'm saying you, the legislature, then let's sit down and talk and let's modify it. But I'm going to look. As an Attorney General, I'm going to go in seeking the broadest authorities I can get. And I know one thing the legislature needs to be concerned about is the next year I'm going to come in and ask for more money to fund it.
Well, yeah, all of that is true. You know, what is interesting to me as well is the fact that this discrepancy between the authorities of the Attorney General to go after consumer protection, but not after civil rights, should be a very big determinant in our civil rights performance.
Look, I think the Attorney General should have at least concurrent jurisdiction with the Civil Rights Commission. I think there should be some. There should be authority to bring independent action. Okay. I just wholeheartedly believe that.
Okay. Have you ever thought of mandating or sort of pushing for mandated insurance for gun owners?
I like that idea. And that's a great idea. We can mandate insurance for an automobile, and of course you're going to get your Second Amendment folks say, well, an automobile, there's no Second Amendment right. There's a Second Amendment right to bear arms. Is insurance unreasonably burdensome? I think it's worth looking at. I think another thing that's worth looking at, and it came up in one of the candidate forums, is manufacturer liability.
You mentioned that Prince George and Baltimore have shortage of staff in their state's attorney's office. Would you consider deputizing some of your 400 attorneys to counties if necessary?
Well, I don't know if I would use the term deputize. What I would do and what I will do is I am going to work with state's attorneys. And that's not to say that it's not happening today, because in fact, I was talking to the Howard County State's Attorney, who was sharing with me recently some of his experiences working with the Attorney General's office to get support and assistance on cases. The problem is that you have to go to the legislature to get authority or a letter from the governor. And what I would, number one, advocate for is just give me blanket authority so I can work with state's attorneys, assigning or at least loaning. That may be a better term than deputizing, but they're always going to work for me.
Anthony Brown, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. Good luck in the campaign.
Sunil, thank you.
Sunshine or rain, I still love you the same. 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 I am you and you are.
That was Congressmember Anthony Brown, who is now running in the Democratic primary to be Maryland's Attorney General. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'll be back with Katie Curran O'Malley, who is the other Democratic candidate running for Maryland Attorney General.
Heal our voices as we sing, 'cause I believe in love, sweet love.
Katie Curran O'Malley, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You're running to be Attorney General of Maryland. What do you think are the top three issues the new state attorney general will have to address?
And I think the three very, very important areas of the attorney general is to protect consumers, to protect our environment, because without our environment, we're not going to be consumers, right? As well as to make sure that we combat violent crime, but in such a way that we are making sure that our criminal justice system is fair and transparent. Those are three big areas that the Attorney General actually works on day in and day out.
So recently, the Goucher College poll found that Marylanders, the plurality of Marylanders think that public safety is the top issue in Maryland. Have you seen the poll? Do you have any views on what the public safety issues are?
Sure. Well, I haven't seen it. I've heard about it, but I've been actually talking to people all around our state, not just in Baltimore City, but in cities everywhere. And we are seeing a spike in violent crime, especially when it relates to gun violence. We're seeing an increase in homicides, not just in Maryland, but across the country. The New York Times just had an article this morning about the mass shootings that have occurred most recently all across the country. A decade ago when there was a mass shooting, everyone was shocked, but now we've become numb to it. And the Attorney General plays a huge role in combating violent crime when it comes to organized crime and gang violence. Attorney General Frosch established the Organized Crime Division in 2015, and he has 10 prosecutors working there now. And I have prosecuted cases for a decade when I was a young lawyer. And then as a trial judge for 20 years, I have heard thousands and thousands of cases involving violent crime and how to deal with it and come up with solutions. I think one of the main things we have to do now is collaborate. We've got all these politicians talking about what each other's not doing, whether it's, there aren't enough good laws or we don't have people enforcing the laws in their prospective jurisdictions, or it's this politician blaming the judges. And we really can't have any more of that, Sunil. We have to come together and collaborate. And that's what Attorney General Frosch has been doing with the Organized Crime Division. He's able to he's 10 lawyers there that work with state, local, and federal law enforcement to target where the most violent crimes are happening, multi-jurisdictional. So not just in one area, but certainly there's a lot of crime that comes out of Baltimore City and then goes out into these other jurisdictions. And by having this unit, you're able to coordinate with all these law enforcement agencies a better way of dealing with it and tackling with it. And he's really done a remarkable job in that area. So I would want to continue with that, but increase the amount of lawyers there because 10's just not enough right now when we're seeing this huge spike.
That's interesting. Do you think that the current spike in homicides and other violent crime is related to organized crime and gang violence? I did an interview with Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy for his candidate interview. And there was almost no mention of organized crime in all of that interview. There was no mention of gang violence in all of that interview. So I'm a little bit surprised that you framed the increase in crime and violent crime in terms of organized crime and gang violence.
So no. That wasn't what I was saying. It's misunderstood. Each local state's attorney has their own crimes, but non-violent crimes, violent crimes. And some of that might entail gang violence and organized crime. That can be a part of what John McCarthy is dealing with in his office. A good part of it might not be. It might just be individuals, getting firearms illegally or legally, or committing crimes against other people that have nothing to do with organized crime. But the Attorney General doesn't have authority to usurp the power of the local jurisdiction state's attorneys. And they get very territorial about that, as they should. They're elected by their counties and cities, and they should be able to make decisions for their own jurisdictions. The Attorney General's office has very limited, when you talk about the 19 different units that are in the AG's office, there's one organized crime division that does deal with prosecutorial matters, like I said, specifically organized crime, human trafficking, gun trafficking, drug distribution, as well as murders whenever there's an organized element to that, as well as rapes when there's an organized element to that. So any type of violent crime, and can do it on a multi-jurisdictional level with the collaboration of the local state's attorneys. So that's local law enforcement as well as federal law enforcement. It gets a little complicated to some extent. The other thing the Attorney General has when it comes to the authority of prosecuting criminal activity it's very limited. I mean, there's environmental crimes that the Attorney General office does proceed with, because as a judge, I had many attorney generals come before me for polluters, environmental polluters. So they have criminal authority there as well. And then also in their criminal investigations division, they have authority to investigate, public fraud, things of that nature. So when it comes to the violent crime, which we were talking about, the AG does play a big role in that division. But the state's attorneys all across our state have the, original jurisdiction to pursue all types of crimes, organized or not. And so when the Attorney General steps in, it's usually in collaboration with these other jurisdictions that are asking for additional resources, because when it is multi-jurisdictional, they need the assistance of someone to collaborate and bring it all together. The Attorney General also handles all of the appeals. So all the criminal appeals that happen from the circuit courts of our state are all handled by the Attorney Generals to the Court of Special Appeals and the Court of Appeals, and can even take those cases as high up as the Supreme Court. Because when my father was Attorney General, he actually argued 2 criminal Supreme Court cases that arose from crimes that had happened here in the state. And he was 2-0. He won both of those cases.
Thank you for clarifying. Could you also clarify what you think is going on with the increase? What, in your view, is the cause behind the increase in violent crime in Maryland?
Right now, and everyone is sort of looking at the pandemic again, and what did the pandemic do? Obviously, it caused a lot of us to be isolated, frustrated, angry, sad. There's been a spike in mental health issues with children, with adults. You can't find therapists to work in the schools because they're just overworked and overwhelmed, if you will. And there's really not a lot of budgeting for the increased services of mental health. So it is a perfect storm, if you will, Sunil, of the lack of people being able to gather socially, combined with the isolation issues that so many people have faced and the lack of services to address any of the mental health issues. So that's one component of it. There's also a component of lack of enforcement to some extent in areas across the state. Police departments haven't necessarily been fully staffed. People are not really eager to join the police force. And that's because I think we have a lot of work to do as a community and as a country. And here in Maryland, I put out a paper on criminal justice reform. One of the main things we need to do is make policing transparent and accountable so that people feel safe when they call the police. And so police feel safe when they go to a location. By having body-worn cameras on all officers across the state really makes everyone accountable and feel like the process is transparent. So you have the mental health issues, you have, a lack of policing because people don't want to go into that field. And then in Baltimore City, we're under a consent decree. So police have even said they won't get out of the car to make an arrest when they see a drug deal because they know that it's not going to get prosecuted, or they may get into some issue with the people. And so they're just not getting out of the cars. And they will tell you that because as the last 5 years, and the consent decree will be 4 years, I have had, police officers not show up for court, or when they did come, they wouldn't have their evidence. And there's just not a lot of zeal for enforcement.
This is not really an attorney general's problem, but it seems to be a big one, this unwillingness to enforce. How do you address that?
The question we were answering was, why do we have all this crime? So as a lawyer, as a judge, and as a prosecutor, I can only tell you what I have seen. I'm not a criminologist, but I can tell you what I've seen is spike in mental health, and then this issue with the police department and not wanting to enforce certain crimes. And certainly the ones that do are all really good men and women that are out there working and trying to do their best, but they're understaffed. And that's a huge problem as well. So how do we solve that? Each local jurisdiction has their police department that is overseen by their county executives and or their mayor. And I think we're having these county executives and mayors work collaboratively with the AG on how to solve those issues of either staffing, but also making our police departments, like I said, transparent and accountable is the best way when we're going forward talking about public safety.
I imagine that one of the reasons why the police are not getting out of their cars, as you described, is because things have become more transparent and accountable, right? Because of the consent decree that imposes this kinds of accountability measures and transparency measures, that's why it's happening. So how does more transparency and accountability solve the problem of police not wanting to get out of their cars?
No, I don't. I think that's a blanket answer, assumption. I think, when I say the police don't want to get out of their cars, that's not all the police. That's a good portion of them in the jurisdiction right now where I sat for the past 20 years. And it hasn't been until just recently that that's been something that's occurred. I don't know if that's necessarily happening in the Prince George's County Police Department or the Montgomery County Police Department or Anne Arundel. I think each jurisdiction is different. And I do believe that the transparency and accountability is something that the police all welcome. They want the body worn cameras because they want to make sure that there isn't going to be some dispute about something they did or didn't do when it comes to court. And the citizens want it as well, because the citizens want to be protected when they call the police. They want to make sure that, this sort of culture of corruption or culture of like the gun trace task force has ended. So people like it, police like it. I don't think it's not the reason why police do or don't get out of their car. And I think specifically, I can only speak to my experience as a trial judge in Baltimore City. And they've told me it's the consent decree. They've told community leaders it's the consent decree. That doesn't mean the consent decree is bad. It just means we have to continue with training the police officers, attracting more police officers who are, well trained when it comes to constitutional law, state constitution, federal constitution, when it comes to the laws that are applicable, learning how to keep communities safe. And at the same time, making sure that what they're doing is transparent and accountable.
Which leads to a question about civil rights, right? And especially civil rights protection as in the context of police department. The Maryland Attorney General is a little bit unique in that they do not prosecute civil rights cases, that's my understanding. What is your view on that?
Well, they don't prosecute the civil rights cases from the Civil Rights Unit, which was established in 2017, because they don't have the legal authority to do that. So in order to prosecute civil rights cases and to investigate pattern and practices, say, within a police department, there needs to be authority. And that can come either through a governor's letter, just like they got the authority to prosecute those criminal cases, and or the authority could come from the General Assembly. So I think it's something that I would definitely work on, because it would be a good thing to have the Attorney General able to do enforcement when it comes to civil rights, especially when it comes to investigating pattern and practices in housing, police departments, education, sometimes I think there was a big issue in a couple of the counties about appraising of houses and having a higher appraisal if you are a person Caucasian or European, or as opposed to Blacks or brown people. So that's an issue that might be a pattern and practice investigation that the AG could spearhead and be able to make decisions about whether or not there should be civil or criminal enforcement.
Do you think the Maryland General Assembly is in a place that it will give you that authority. I understand a letter from the governor is a different thing. But with the General Assembly, will they give you do you think they'll give you this authority?
It's always tricky, when you're talking about what the General Assembly will or won't do. Certainly, who would oppose it? But I have to tell you that, again, when it comes to overstepping what because the individual state's attorneys who are elected actually get to prosecute hate crimes now and, criminal civil rights violations in their own jurisdictions. So what happens now with the civil rights unit, if there's a complaint, it oftentimes is referred and says, hey, we have this, workplace civil rights issue, or we have a sexual harassment based on a civil rights issue. Do you want to take it? And most of the jurisdictions want to take those crimes and want to prosecute those cases. So the General Assembly might get lobbied very hard from the Maryland States Attorneys Association not to give that authority to the AG. But I would want that authority so I could work collaboratively with these individual jurisdictions, because when it comes to the pattern and practice of civil rights violations, when it's much more, not like a hate crime necessarily that you can see as a sort of blatant violation of someone's rights, but when we're talking about pattern and practices in housing and education, these are the types of things that you really need multi-jurisdictional help with, because oftentimes it is something that's happening not just in Baltimore City and Montgomery County, it's happening with different companies on a statewide level. So working with these different agencies would be the best way to go. And that's how I would argue that it should be a good thing for the entire state, not taking any power away from these individual jurisdictions, but working with them so that statewide we could enforce civil rights.
A little while ago, you said that there was an effort to blame judges. The General Assembly has been looking at bills that want to change transparency in how courts work. Have you looked at those bills? Do you have a view on them?
I've talked to some of the legislators about the different bills for transparency in the judiciary, and I'm 100% for it. I have to say, ever since I've been a trial lawyer, I tried hundreds of cases in front of judges and jurors. It's all public. It's all open. Courtrooms have to be open. And everything that happens in the courtroom is recorded, obviously, for appeal purposes. And as 20 years as a trial judge, everything that came out of my mouth was recorded. Every bit of, anything that happened with the lawyers, with the witnesses is all recorded. So in that essence, the courtrooms are open and they're transparent. But I think what some people would like to see, and I certainly can understand this, is that there be cameras in the courtrooms. The only thing we have to balance, though, quite frankly, is you are going to have a real fear of witnesses who are coming to court if they think they're going to be on camera. And in other jurisdictions, the way they've done that is they've blurred the face of the witness. They've also changed the voice of the witness. However, there are still certain things I think witnesses would be hesitant about. So we really just need to balance the safety of witnesses and victims when they're coming to court, if it's going to be recorded, to make sure that their identity, even though their name has to be on the record, that will happen unless there's some other issue that is, pre-trial adjudicated before a judge.
What about bills that look at prosecutorial reform? Have you thought about those?
We have talked to a couple of the state's attorneys about it. And the bottom line is, when it comes to criminal prosecution, you have to have an open file policy. When I was in the state's attorney's office in Baltimore County, lawyers would come in, and it's all on MDEC now, but lawyers would come in and physically say, "Can I see your file?" And I'd hand it over. Here's my evidence. That's what the law says I have to do. And then when it comes to work product, though, that's where it gets a little bit different. Or when it comes to, if an employee got sanctioned for some reason, whether it was a prosecutor or not, does all of that information, get to be discoverable for each individual case like it would necessarily for police officers who've been sanctioned for misconduct? I don't know. I mean, sometimes it can go a little bit too far, but I do think having an open file policy, open MDEC file policy, because a lot of it's electronic, is the right way to go. Because you should never, as a prosecutor, have anything that you're hiding from the defense as far as evidence that you're going to produce. It's against the law.
Well, you can have a stated open file policy, but not an effective one, and there is considerable variation around the state around how this is actually done. Do you think the Attorney General has any role in bringing some uniformity and some standards to that?
Well, like I said, each jurisdiction elects their independently elected state's attorney. So the Attorney General doesn't really have the authority to tell these jurisdictions how to run their offices. But certainly if there's a law that's passed in the legislature about what these offices have to disclose, the Attorney General certainly has to make sure the laws are being enforced. And that happens with the criminal appeals. So, if a case gets appealed and one of the issues on appeal is, the state's attorney didn't hand over exculpatory evidence, well, then as Attorney General, my lawyers would concede on that issue.
Are there any environmental protection issues that you are looking at particularly?
Well, there was a bill that I was very excited about that was being presented this session by Delegate Ruth and Delegate Teresa, and it was going to give the Attorney General the authority to prosecute fossil fuel companies that trade over $10 million, give them the authority, $10 billion, dollars, give the AG the authority to prosecute cases where you could show the fossil fuel company was there was a causal relation between the fossil fuel company and climate change. And it's $1 billion. So any fossil fuel company that is large enough and that the AG's office can investigate to determine that company's causing climate change, that would give the AG's office the ability to prosecute it. And they can be, as you can imagine, very complicated sorts of cases. And you might even be joining other attorneys general in the surrounding states. So the bill also was going to allow for the Attorney General's office to hire outside counsel to actually handle those cases for Marylanders, because again, they're very highly technical and I don't have the expertise in that area. So it would be a situation where the Attorney General would then, if we got that authority, be able to work with other states and find plaintiffs' lawyers that could pursue that.
I was going to ask, are there other states that have similar kind of legislation? Because I would find that will quickly go to Supreme Court.
Delaware does. And I don't know how long Delaware has had that, but Delaware has had it, and I believe New York. But I'd have to look back into that for you. So it's not something new to Maryland, but these two delegates who are very, very committed to working towards finding ways for us to combat climate change have presented that. And unfortunately, it didn't make it out of committee this session. But a lot of times good bills have to go back to the legislature year after year before they pass, like marriage equality.
Sure. Anything on plastic packaging, styrofoam?
Yeah, I'm so glad. I think last year our Baltimore City delegation was able to get rid of the plastic bags here in the city. And I saw just recently, not plastic or styrofoam, but Starbucks is going to be trying to do away with the amount of cups that end up in landfills now as a result of consumers buying coffee from Starbucks. And as we all know, Starbucks means coffee. So it's a huge amount.
10 companies cause 90% of the plastic pollution around the world. 10 companies.
So we got rid of styrofoam and the plastic bags in Baltimore City. When I say we, it was the great members of our delegation, the city delegation, that did that.
Grocery stores still use styrofoam for produce. For some reason, the grocery stores have pushed back against that kind of statewide, and it requires statewide law to be able to do. But really, 10 corporations cause 90% of the plastic pollution. We should be able to regulate that.
I think you're right. And I would work with the legislators to come up with a bill to do that statewide, because it's working great here in Baltimore City. Have you had any thoughts about restructuring the AG's office somehow? Have you thought about that? Restructuring, it's actually got a very good structure. I think the biggest problem right now facing the Attorney General's office is being able to attract and retain great lawyers. There are really good workers there now, but what's happened is their salaries are not competitive at all with the local jurisdictions, states' attorneys, or they're not competitive with the law firms that are able to attract kids when they come out of law school that have to pay these insurmountable law school debts. So it would be really a great thing if the next governor would be a Democrat, and if that next governor would increase the Attorney General's budget to allow us to hire more lawyers, because like I said, in some of these units, like the organized crime unit, it's 10 lawyers in criminal appeals. I would have to say it's about that, or maybe a little bit more. And right now, with these legislative maps being litigated, there are 2 lawyers that are dedicated to defending the legislative map and the congressional map. Just 2 lawyers. And when the first case ends, the next case starts right away. So those 2 lawyers are not going to have a lot of time to prepare, even though I'm quite sure they'll do a great job, because the lawyers in the Attorney General's office are the brightest and best.
Katie Curran O'Malley, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. Good luck in the campaign.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
That's Katie Curran O'Malley running for the Democratic nomination to be Maryland Attorney General. You can find out more about her at katie4md.com and follow her on Twitter at katie4md. You can find out more about Anthony Brown at anthonybrown.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at brown4md. That's all for this episode. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from DC-based singer-songwriter Emily Hall. I hope you'll listen, like, and share the show as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.
Just let it move on through. In the power of expression, we find the connection to live our truth. I've been trying to learn how to face the sadness. I've been trying to learn how to feel this grief. From moments of love to moments of loneliness, I surrender in gratitude for